They say the golden child can do no wrong in a parent's eyes, but gold is heavy, and if you aren't careful, it will drag you straight to the bottom. For 25 years, I watched my brother get everything, the cars, the praise, and eventually the entire family estate. I was written out entirely, told I needed to make my own way. When they signed the final deed over to him, my brother smiled at me, thinking he had won the ultimate game. I just smiled back, because I knew something about those assets that he didn't, and the IRS was about to find out too. My name is Eric. I grew up in a small, old town in New England. Life there was simple and predictable. In the winter, thick snow covered everything like a quiet white blanket, and in the summer, long rows of trees lined the streets, making the whole town feel peaceful and timeless. My father started a small construction company back in the 1970s. In the beginning, he did everything himself. He carried bricks, he mixed cement, he worked side by side with the same laborers he later ended up managing. Slowly, year after year, the company grew. Eventually, the business expanded into real estate development, and little by little, our family's life started getting better. My mother used to say something often when we were kids. Family is the most valuable thing in the world. Money comes and goes. But the truth inside our house felt a little different. There was an unwritten rule in our family, and that rule revolved around my brother, Jack. Jack was 2 years younger than me, but somehow in our house he was always more important. From a very young age, he was the center of attention. He had great grades in school. He was the captain of the football team. He had more friends than anyone I knew, and at every party, he seemed to naturally become the center of the room. My father used to say proudly, "This boy is going places one day." Whenever guests visited our home, Jack was the one everyone talked to. He was the one they asked questions. He was the one my father proudly introduced. I was there too, but mostly I stayed quiet. My interests were different. While Jack loved sports and social events, I preferred books and computers. I could spend hours sitting in front of a screen writing code. When I was 17, I built a small software tool for my father's company. It helped organize invoices and simplified their accounting process. I remember feeling proud when I showed it to him. I thought maybe this would finally impress him. But he only glanced at the screen and said, "It's good, but businesses aren't run by computers." Then he turned to Jack and added, "Real business is about leading people." That sentence stayed in my mind for years. Before we dive deeper into the story, a small request. Please subscribe to the channel, like the video, and don't forget to write the name of your city in the comments section. Back to the story. Time passed. I decided to study computer science in college. Jack, on the other hand, chose business administration. After graduation, I joined my father's company. My job in the beginning was pretty simple: organizing data, reviewing accounts, and slowly converting decades of old paperwork into digital records. But the more time I spent inside the system, the more I started noticing problems. The accounting methods were outdated. Tax planning was weak, and many property records were incomplete or poorly documented. So I began fixing things quietly. For years, I focused on modernizing the systems. Some weeks, I worked more than 60 hours. Sometimes I stayed in the office until 2 in the morning. But whenever the company achieved something big, my father always gave the credit to Jack. One day, I finally gathered the courage to ask him something. I said, "Do you think I could lead the company one day?" He looked at me for a moment and gave a small smile. Then he said the sentence that made everything perfectly clear. "Eric, you work very hard." He paused. "But Jack has something you don't." I asked, "What is it?" He leaned back in his chair and said, "Charisma." Then he tapped the table and added, "People follow leaders with charisma." I didn't argue. I didn't say anything at all, because in that moment, I understood something important. In this family, hard work mattered, but being the favorite mattered more. Still, there was one thing I always paid attention to: the company's financial records, and buried deep inside those records, there was a secret that one day would change the fate of our entire family. After college, I had only one goal in mind. I wanted to make my father's company better. I had a degree in computer science, and I truly believed that if I could modernize the company's systems, the business could grow far beyond what it already was. At that time, most of the company's records were still stored in old filing cabinets and stacks of paperwork. The accounting system was outdated, and many tax decisions were made based more on guesswork than proper planning. So the first thing I did was start converting everything into a digital system. Old contracts, property records, financial statements. I spent months moving every piece of information into an organized database. It wasn't easy. There were weeks when I arrived at the office before everyone else and left long after the lights in the building had gone out. But slowly, the results began to show. Expenses started going down. Profits began to rise. I also designed a better tax planning system so the company could legally reduce what it owed and reinvest more capital back into the business. Within a few years, the growth became impossible to ignore. The company that had once been worth around $8 million had grown to nearly $35 million. But inside the company, one thing never changed: the difference between me and Jack. Jack's role in the business was very different from mine. He handled clients, he negotiated deals, he attended networking events and business dinners, he played golf with investors, and he had a natural ability to make people like him within minutes. My father loved that about him. One afternoon, during a company meeting, my father made an announcement. With a proud smile on his face, he said that Jack would be receiving 40% of the company's shares. He explained that Jack would eventually lead the company into the future. I sat there quietly during the entire meeting. I didn't feel jealous, but I did feel something else: a question. For years, I had been managing the systems that kept the company running, but leadership was always imagined around Jack. Around that same time, I began reviewing the company's financial records more carefully, and during that review, I noticed something important. Over the previous years, my father had quietly transferred several valuable properties into Jack's name. On the surface, the decision made sense. It appeared to be part of a strategy to reduce future inheritance taxes. But the way those transfers were structured wasn't completely safe. The properties had been transferred as gifts. In legal and tax language, they were considered gifted assets. And gifted assets come with a very important rule in tax law, a rule called cost basis. So I decided to talk to my father about it. One evening, when most of the office had already gone home, I walked into his office. I explained that if those properties were truly transferred as gifts, then when Jack eventually sold them, the tax calculation would be very different. In that situation, he wouldn't receive the same tax advantages that usually come with inherited property. My father listened carefully, but he didn't seem worried. He leaned back in his chair, gave a small smile, and said that these were normal legal details. According to him, the company's lawyers and accountants would handle everything. I tried explaining again. If the calculations weren't done correctly, it could create serious problems in the future. But my father ended the conversation with one simple sentence: "Don't worry about it. Jack will handle it." I left his office quietly, and that was the first time I truly realized something. No matter how much knowledge or effort I put into the company, my voice still carried less weight in the family. Years passed. The business continued to grow. Jack became more involved in property deals, and my father slowly stepped away from the daily operations. But during all those years, there was one thing I kept doing. I kept watching the records. Every contract, every property transfer, every financial document passed through my system. And inside those records, there were details that most people would never notice. But to someone who built the accounting system, they were impossible to miss. I knew something else, too. If those documents were ever reviewed by the wrong government agency, they could raise a lot of questions. At the time, I didn't know that only a few years later, those very questions would change the future of our entire family. And that chain of events began the moment our father's life started entering its final chapter. At the beginning of 2023, our father's health suddenly started getting worse. At first, we thought it might just be age catching up with him. After all, he was already approaching 70. But within a few months, his condition declined so much that he was making regular trips to the hospital. By that time, Jack had already started handling most of the company's external business. He managed the deals, he met the clients, and he represented the company in public. Meanwhile, I continued doing what I had always done, managing the financial systems, maintaining the records, keeping the entire structure organized behind the scenes. Our father still came to the office occasionally, but his focus wasn't the same anymore. The man who once controlled every detail of the company now seemed tired and distant. One evening, Jack called me. He said we should go to the hospital. Our father wanted to speak with both of us. When we arrived, the atmosphere in the room felt unusually quiet. Our father was lying in the hospital bed, and sitting beside him was the family lawyer. The moment I saw that, I understood this wasn't a normal conversation. The lawyer spoke first. He explained that our father had finalized his will, and he wanted both of us to hear the details. I sat quietly as the lawyer opened a thick file and began reading. According to the document, the majority of the company's shares would go to Jack. Most of the real estate properties would also be transferred to him. The family house, several valuable parcels of land, and multiple financial accounts, all of them assigned to Jack. For me, the will included only a small apartment and $50,000. For a few seconds, the room was completely silent. I glanced at Jack. His face showed a mixture of surprise and excitement. Even he probably hadn't expected the decision to be this clear. Our father slowly spoke from the hospital bed. His voice was weak but firm. He said the decision had been carefully thought through. In his mind, Jack had the ability to lead the company forward, and as for me, he believed I had the talent to succeed anywhere on my own. Then he added something else.
He said I shouldn't take the decision personally. I simply nodded. At that moment, arguing didn't feel necessary. Somewhere deep down, I think I had always expected this outcome. A few weeks later, our father passed away. After the funeral, the family gathered again at the lawyer's office so the will could be officially executed. That day, the lawyer read the same document once more, only this time it wasn't theoretical anymore. Everything was becoming official. The controlling shares of the company, a large piece of land outside the city, 2 apartment complexes, and our family home. All of it transferred to Jack. When the meeting ended, Jack walked over to me. He seemed slightly uncomfortable. He said he hoped I wasn't upset about the decision. He explained that it had been our father's choice, and there was nothing he could really do about it. I listened quietly. Then I smiled and said, "Don't worry about it. Congratulations." He looked surprised by how calm I was. He shook my hand and told me that if I ever needed help, he would be there. I nodded. Then I left the lawyer's office and went home. That night was cold. The streets were quiet. I walked into my apartment, placed my laptop on the table, and opened the company's old financial records. These were the same records I had spent years organizing. Every property purchase, every transfer, every tax filing, all of it was there. And once again, I noticed the same thing that had caught my attention years earlier. Between 2015 and 2022, our father had transferred properties worth millions of dollars to Jack. They had been labeled as gifts, but their recorded values were significantly lower than their actual market prices. If those properties had been inherited, the tax rules would have been very different. But because they were gifted, they carried a very specific financial responsibility. I reviewed the files carefully: property deeds, gift tax returns, valuation reports. All of them were legitimate documents. But inside them, there were also unanswered questions. And at that moment, a thought crossed my mind. It wasn't revenge, not exactly. It was more like recognizing a reality. Everything my brother had received looked like gold, but gold can be heavy, and if the weight isn't calculated correctly, it can pull a man straight to the bottom. I closed the laptop and leaned back in my chair. For the first time that night, I felt something strange. Maybe life had chosen a very different path for me, and whatever came next was still waiting around the corner.
After our father's death, the responsibility for the company naturally shifted to Jack. Around the city, most people had already started seeing him as the new head of the business. He attended meetings, met with investors, and introduced himself everywhere with the confidence of someone who had fully stepped into power. And in many ways, he had. He now had control, he had wealth, and he had the reputation that came with both. As for me, I had mostly stepped away from the company. Legally, my role had become very limited after the will was executed, so I began focusing more on my own work and my own life. But there was one habit that never really disappeared. I still looked at the records. Maybe it was something I had developed during all those years managing the company's financial systems. Whenever a large property transaction happened in town, the news spread quickly, and whenever I heard about one, curiosity always pushed me to look at the numbers behind it. About 6 months after our father passed away, I heard something interesting. Jack had sold one of the company's major properties. It was a large apartment complex located just outside the city. Our father had purchased it years earlier, and over time, its market value had increased significantly. When I heard the news, I wasn't exactly surprised. Jack had always been the kind of person who made fast decisions. But the sale made me open my old files again. I pulled up the records and started reviewing the details of that property. It was the same property our father had transferred into Jack's name a few years earlier. According to the paperwork, its value at the time of transfer had been recorded much lower than its actual market value. And that's where the important legal detail appeared again, a detail that most people never think about. When someone inherits property, its tax value is calculated based on the market value at the time of inheritance. But when the same property is transferred as a gift, the tax calculation is based on the original purchase price. In tax law, that difference is called cost basis. If someone ignores that rule and reports taxes using the wrong basis when selling the property, it can create a serious problem. I decided to look deeper. A few weeks later, I discovered something else. Jack hadn't sold just one property. He had sold 3. Together, the sales were worth nearly $12 million. That was a very large number, so I ran the calculations again. If the taxes on those properties were calculated using the correct basis, the tax bill would be extremely high. But if someone ignored the original records, the reported tax could appear much smaller.
That was the moment I felt real concern for the first time. At first, I thought maybe I was misunderstanding something, so I decided to speak with an old acquaintance of mine who had previously worked in tax auditing. We met at a small coffee shop downtown. I asked the question hypothetically. I said that if someone received properties as gifts and later sold them while ignoring the original cost basis, what could happen? He didn't hesitate. He said that if something like that were discovered, the authorities would demand the unpaid taxes. On top of that, there would likely be penalties and interest. If the situation appeared intentional, legal consequences could follow as well. I listened carefully. Everything he said confirmed what I already suspected. When I walked out of the coffee shop, a cold wind was moving through the street. Cars passed by quietly as I stood there for a moment, thinking. Years earlier, I had brought this exact issue to our father's attention. At the time, he had dismissed it as a minor technical detail. But now,
that same detail had grown into something much more dangerous. For a moment, I considered speaking with Jack about it, but I quickly changed my mind. Too much distance had grown between us already. And besides, he now owned the company. He might see my warning as interference. So I went home. That night, I sat in front of my computer for hours. The same old files were open on the screen. Property transfers, valuation reports, financial records. All of them were legitimate documents, but inside those documents were questions that still didn't have clear answers. And somewhere in the middle of reviewing them, a thought crossed my mind. It wasn't sudden. Maybe it had been forming quietly for years. If those records were ever reviewed by the right government agency, many things would become very clear. I closed the computer and leaned back in my chair. One thought kept repeating in my mind. Sometimes justice doesn't arrive on its own. Sometimes someone only needs to point toward the truth. And after that, the system takes care of the rest. That night, I stayed awake for a long time. My laptop was open in front of me, and on the screen were the same financial records I had already reviewed countless times. Every time I went through them again, the same question came to my mind. Did Jack actually understand the kind of responsibility he had taken on? Maybe he didn't. Or maybe he believed these were just routine legal details that would somehow resolve themselves. But the reality was different. In financial law, some things are very clear. If the basis of a property is reported incorrectly, it directly affects the tax calculation. And when the numbers reach hundreds of thousands or even millions of dollars, government agencies rarely ignore it. For a moment, I considered warning Jack. After all, he was my brother. We had grown up in the same house. But then I remembered all the moments when my voice had been ignored during the important decisions in our family, especially the day when our father had clearly said that Jack would be the one to lead the company. I hadn't argued that day, and that night, I didn't argue with anyone either. I simply made a decision. A few minutes later, I opened my internet browser and navigated to the website of the relevant government agency. There was a specific form on the site, a form that allowed anyone to report potential financial irregularities. The report could even be submitted anonymously. I opened the form and slowly began entering the information. I didn't write any personal opinions, only facts, dates of property transfers, estimated values, and the transactions that might raise questions.
Everything I entered was already documented in official records. When I finished the form, I stared at the screen for a few seconds. Then I uploaded the files. And finally, I pressed the submit button. After that, the room became completely quiet. I closed the laptop and walked over to the window. Outside, the night had grown deep, and the street was almost empty. At that moment, I had no idea what would happen next. Maybe nothing. Maybe the report would simply disappear into a pile of paperwork somewhere. Or maybe, one day, an investigator would decide to look at those records. Some decisions in life don't show their consequences immediately. Sometimes the results appear weeks or even months later. About a month passed. During that time, I focused on my own life. I had started a small technology project, and most of my time went into building it. Then, one afternoon, my phone suddenly rang. The name on the screen was Jack. I answered the call. His voice sounded unusually tense. He said he had received a letter from a government agency. According to the letter, his financial activities were being reviewed. It was an initial audit notice. The document requested information about several property transactions. I listened quietly as he explained everything. At the end of the call, he asked me something directly. Did I know anything about it? I replied calmly. I told him I didn't know the details of the situation. I also mentioned that sometimes letters like that are sent as part of routine procedures.
He stayed silent for a moment. Then he said that maybe it really was nothing serious, but from the tone of his voice, it was obvious he didn't fully believe that himself. After the call ended, I placed the phone back on the table. I already knew something he didn't. This was only the beginning. The real story had just started. Because once a financial investigation begins, new details have a way of appearing, and sometimes one small question can change the entire story.
The letter Jack received wasn't just a routine questionnaire. It clearly stated that his recent financial activities were under review, and additional information about specific property transactions was required. Letters like this often reach business owners, but the level of detail requested in this one indicated that this was not just a formal procedure. At first, Jack didn't take it too seriously. He spoke to his accountant, who reassured him that most audits are routine. If all documents are accurate, the accountant said, the process usually wraps up within a few weeks. But within days, the situation began to change. Another letter arrived. This time, it demanded even more records. The original purchase prices of the properties, the dates of transfers, all subsequent sales agreements, and a strict reminder, all documents must be complete and accurate. Now, Jack realized this was not a trivial matter. He immediately retained an experienced tax attorney. The attorney advised him to gather every financial record and prepare detailed explanations for every single transaction, because even one missing or incomplete document could complicate the case further. The following weeks were extremely stressful for Jack. He spent long hours in the office, reviewing files, consulting accountants, and attending meetings with his lawyer. And the more he reviewed, the more questions emerged. The root issue was the same one that had been quietly building for years. The properties Dad had transferred to Jack years ago had been reported at significantly lower values than the actual market price. At the time, it was likely seen as a legitimate tax planning strategy. But now, that same strategy had become the focal point of scrutiny. When Jack sold those properties, he reported taxes based on the records he had on hand. But the auditors now wanted to know, what was the original basis? How were these values determined? During one meeting, Jack's lawyer made it clear, you must provide a complete explanation for every single document. Any discrepancy could result in not just back taxes, but fines and interest as well. Jack's confidence faltered. He was genuinely worried. And then, one evening, he called me. His voice was serious, more serious than I had ever heard it. He explained that the situation had grown complex. He needed someone who truly understood the company's old accounting system. I know you worked on the system for years, he said. Maybe you can help me navigate this. I paused. Then I said slowly, the company is your responsibility now. You are capable of making the right decisions on your own. The words echoed from years ago, the same ones once spoken to me. A few seconds of silence passed over the phone. Then Jack simply said, I understand. The call ended. I set the phone down and looked out the window. Evening had fallen. The sky was slowly darkening. I knew the audit process had only just begun, and once a complete review of financial records starts, hidden details often surface, details that were never considered important before. This is the moment when the truth gradually emerges, and now it was about to.
Within just a few weeks of the audit starting, Jack's life began to change in ways no one could have anticipated. Before, he was seen as a successful businessman in the city, confident at events, smooth in conversations, always discussing future plans. But now, that confidence was gone. Most of his time was spent in meetings with lawyers and accountants. Each new meeting brought additional documents, and with every document, more questions surfaced. Slowly, the news began reaching the rest of the family. One evening, Mom called me. Her voice carried worry, a sense of helplessness. She explained that Jack was under immense pressure, constantly consulting different legal advisors. She didn't understand why all of this was happening. I tried to reassure her, telling her that audits can sometimes be routine, but I knew this time it was far from ordinary. A few days later, the family gathered. It wasn't a formal meeting, but the atmosphere felt like everyone was searching for answers. Jack was there, exhausted. He explained that the auditors had requested financial records dating back many years, specifically questioning the properties transferred to him by Dad. Mom, visibly worried, asked if this was a major problem. Jack replied that it was too early to say, but if discrepancies were found, the amount owed could be significant. A hush fell over the room. Then Jack said something that made the tension even heavier. He mentioned that audits like this usually begin after a tip or notification. According to him, someone may have provided information about the company's financial records to the authorities. Everyone exchanged glances. Mom tried to brush it off, insisting it might be coincidence, but Jack's mind was made up.
A few days later, he called me again. This time, his voice carried the same worry, but also something else. Suspicion. He didn't ask directly, but he implied one thing. Only someone who knew the company's old records intimately could have provided that information. I listened quietly. Then I simply said, "The records have been seen by many people. Accountants, lawyers, financial advisors, they all had access." He was silent for a moment. Finally, he said just one sentence. "If I ever find out who did this, I will never forgive them." I didn't respond. After the call ended, I sat thinking for a long time. Some decisions in life reach a point of no return. By now, this situation had gone far enough that everything was moving on its own path. The audit was still underway, and with each passing day, it became clear that the consequences would not be minor. This wasn't just a review of financial records, it was an examination of the entire system, the very foundation of the life Jack had built for himself. And soon, the results of that examination would begin to show.
8 months had passed since the audit began. During this time, Jack's life was a constant cycle of pressure and uncertainty. At first, you hoped that a few explanations would resolve everything. But as the weeks turned into months, it became painfully clear this was no ordinary audit. Every few weeks, his lawyer received new questions. Original copies of old contracts were requested. Clarifications about the historic prices of properties were demanded. The auditors were especially focused on the assets that Dad had transferred to Jack years ago. And then, the day finally came. The letter arrived. The one everyone had been waiting for and fearing. It was a detailed report, the final audit results. The findings were stark. Jack had not reported the taxes on the sold properties correctly. The records showed a significant discrepancy between the original value of the assets and the declared sale price. Based on this gap, a substantial amount of unpaid taxes had accumulated. But that was not all. Since the discrepancy spanned multiple years of financial records, penalties and interest also applied. When all numbers were totaled, the amount was staggering: $14 million. Jack was stunned. He immediately held several meetings with his lawyers, exploring all legal avenues. Most experts agreed. The audit results would be nearly impossible to fully challenge. The records themselves left little room for doubt. After weeks of deliberation, Jack made a hard choice. He decided to settle with the authorities. This meant liquidating multiple valuable assets to pay off the owed amount. First, the major company shares were sold. Next, the land outside the city, planned by Dad for the future, was sold. Finally, the family home had to be mortgaged to cover the remaining balance. These were not easy decisions, but Jack had few options left. News of the settlements quickly reached the family. Mom was deeply affected. She had always believed the family business would endure for generations, but now Everything had changed. Within months, even the large family home was lost. Mom had to move into a small apartment. One evening, Jack called me. Fatigue and despair were audible in his voice. He said that almost everything was gone. The company, the lands, the home we once took pride in, all slipping away one by one. He paused. Then, in a quiet, almost trembling voice, he said, "If you ever find out who started all of this, you have to tell me." I simply replied, "Sometimes life events create their own path." After the call, I sat in silence for a long while. This was the outcome that had been set in motion years ago. At the time, no one had paid attention. Major events rarely happen overnight. They build slowly, and when they are complete, their impact touches everything around them.
Everything I entered was already documented in official records. When I finished the form, I stared at the screen for a few seconds. Then I uploaded the files. And finally, I pressed the submit button. After that, the room became completely quiet. I closed the laptop and walked over to the window. Outside, the night had grown deep, and the street was almost empty. At that moment, I had no idea what would happen next. Maybe nothing. Maybe the report would simply disappear into a pile of paperwork somewhere. Or maybe, one day, an investigator would decide to look at those records. Some decisions in life don't show their consequences immediately. Sometimes the results appear weeks or even months later. About a month passed. During that time, I focused on my own life. I had started a small technology project, and most of my time went into building it. Then, one afternoon, my phone suddenly rang. The name on the screen was Jack. I answered the call. His voice sounded unusually tense. He said he had received a letter from a government agency. According to the letter, his financial activities were being reviewed. It was an initial audit notice. The document requested information about several property transactions. I listened quietly as he explained everything. At the end of the call, he asked me something directly. Did I know anything about it? I replied calmly. I told him I didn't know the details of the situation. I also mentioned that sometimes letters like that are sent as part of routine procedures. He stayed silent for a moment. Then he said that maybe it really was nothing serious, but from the tone of his voice, it was obvious he didn't fully believe that himself. After the call ended, I placed the phone back on the table. I already knew something he didn't. This was only the beginning. The real story had just started. Because once a financial investigation begins, new details have a way of appearing, and sometimes one small question can change the entire story. Life is rarely fair. Sometimes it hands you challenges you never expected. Sometimes it shows you paths you never chose. But the true lesson lies not in the circumstances, it lies in how you respond to them. I watched my brother rise with power, and I watched him struggle to hold on to it. I inherited a small apartment and a fraction of wealth, but I also inherited something far more valuable: clarity, patience, and perspective. I realized that life is not about how much you have. It's about understanding the weight of what comes to you. It's about knowing when to act and when to step back. The decisions we make, the choices we ignore, the silence we keep, all of these shape not only our own lives, but the lives of those around us. My brother learned the hard way that power and wealth without knowledge can crumble. I learned that sometimes restraint is more powerful than action. Time moves forward, people change, circumstances fade, but lessons stay with us forever. And perhaps that is the ultimate inheritance: not money, not property,
not titles, but the understanding of life itself. Sometimes the heaviest gold is the one you never touch. Sometimes the strongest power is the one you don't fight for. And in the end, life rewards those who see beyond the immediate, those who think long-term, and those who act with patience, wisdom, and clarity. This is the lesson I carry with me. This is the story I will never forget.